Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This special episode, recorded at the Online Educa Conference in Berlin 2024, gave Donald and John a chance to address some of the burning questions that listeners have asked about the series. What have we learned about the theory and practice of learning? Can people really learn from history? Why was this podcast necessary in the first place? And how are the voices we have heard from so far selected? It also gave a valuable chance to reflect on 3 years and 36 episodes of this very popular show.
Welcome everybody to this live recording of Great Minds on Learning Question Time. Thank you. I'm your host, John Helmer, and with me as ever is our own resident great mind, Donald Clark. So we're looking back today on 3 years since we first launched this podcast, 36 episodes, hundreds of theorists, spanning 2,500 years from the Greeks to the geeks. And we thought it was about time to hear from the listeners, you people, and the questions they have about what we've been doing here. How many people are regular listeners to Great Minds on Learning? Just show of hands there. Oh, quite a few. How many of you have ever heard an episode of Great Minds on Learning? Yes, good. And a lot of fresh meat as well, which is very encouraging for us marketing types. So we wanted to really hear from the people who've been listening and what questions they have. We had loads of questions. People are always coming up to us at live events and in the street. So we don't always capture who they're by, so we've kind of grouped them a bit. And other people have posted to us on social media, so we'll name names where we can. More recently, we put out call for questions, and we'll be throwing those in. Also, there'll be a roving mic to answer your questions from the floor. We'd really love to have questions from you, not saved up to the end, but as we go along. So we're dividing it into 3 sections, and we can have questions at the end of each one. Donald has very carefully divided these very well into why, what, and what next. So the why, as in why do we do it for a start? It's not like there's loads of money in it. What was our rationale for the people we've chosen to talk about? And the people we've not chosen to talk about? What are the lessons we've learned? Is the what? What's the picture that emerges from what we've seen so far and what we learned from all this? And finally, we'll talk about what next. How do we see the future? A lot of futurism going on at this conference. And we're just going to add a bit more. So first of all, I'd like to turn it over to you, Donald, to talk a bit about the background to the podcast, which really has its genesis in your blog and a huge number of posts you've amassed over the years about these learning theorists, a formidable resource. Donald, from your point of view, how did it come about?
Well, this was a long time ago now, so I'm getting on a bit. And it was... When I first came into this industry, something weird happened. So it was the learning industry, and I knew nothing about learning. Okay, but we had started a business, and we had to earn some money to live on. And it turned out to be a hugely successful business. But at the beginning, I was going into these rooms and hearing names like Bloom and Maslow and so on. I had no idea who they were. It turns out that people who were using these names didn't know either. So, but I'm a sort of research guy by background, quite data-driven. I'm a bookish person. So I went and bought the books, and I went, God, this is an amazing industry here. Nobody knows shit about anything, honestly. So the first one was Bloom, and Bloom was I really like Bloom to this day, but I hate Bloom at the same time because everybody's obsessed by that stupid triangle pyramid, which he never did. This is my first exposure. So people were showing me this on slides, this amazing triangle. I thought, that seems a bit weird and simplistic, just this crappy knowledge stuff down at the back. And of course, me, as a member of faculty or a trainer, will take you to nirvana with a transformative critical thinking path at the top of the pyramid. I thought, that seems like bullshit to me. And it turned out to be bullshit, of course, because his pupil actually rewrote the theory, going, knowledge is marbled like fat into the meat. It's much more complex and nuanced than that pattern. Then Maslow came along, and I go, I don't even know why you're telling me about Maslow. What has this hierarchy of needs got to do with me as a teacher or a trainer or anything? And of course, it has nothing to do with you as a teacher or a trainer. Nobody walks into a classroom quoting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I went back and read Maslow. Turns out I'm one of the few people I've ever met in my life who's actually read any Maslow. Because again, they were just using the pyramid without much thought. And of course, Maslow was the worst researcher in the world. He just chose his friends. It was complete bullshit, really. There's nothing like a hierarchy like that. So that was the second one. And then I came across Myers and Briggs. I'd never heard of them either. And people were actually using this in workplace learning to, determine recruitment and promotion and all sorts of things. I went back and read that, and I went, Myers and Briggs, neither of them had any qualifications. It was based on this really weird subset of Jung. I was going, this is amazing. So I said, so I had some people in the company, and I said, I've read all this stuff. I'm going to start training people in the stuff that I'm picking up at the same time. And that was 1985, and I've been doing it ever since. So I was just whenever I heard a name, I'd go back and do the reading and write an article, about 2 pages, in order to do that. So that was the origin of the thing, really. It was my personal need, but also my very clear perception that the world of learning isn't very reflective on it. If you're in engineering, every engineer who would know who Newton was, who Einstein was, and they would know theories of forces. In the learning world, if you say, who are the big theorists in learning theory? People struggle to name 3, and even the 3 they name, they don't know, they have certainly never read any of them, in my experience. But they quote them freely. Another one was Vygotsky. That came much later. I went, that's interesting. And I found this massive bias in people that in the literature I was reading, or the conferences like this I was coming to, there was this massive bias towards social constructivism as a theory, which I was a bit suspicious about. I'm not a social constructivist, but I thought, this is interesting. And people kept quoting Vygotsky to me. So I went back and read Mind and Society, and thought that he's only written 2 books, and I was going, the stuff people are telling me isn't Vygotsky at all. It's just some vague idea that all learning should be social and we should all get together in little rooms and groups and learn stuff. It was as primitive as that. So this is what led to a more rational approach to it all, really, was my skepticism about what I was hearing and an attempt to just get it more objective.
So I think that kind of covers how it came about. But if we want to dig more into the why do people need to know about this stuff? I mean, it's ancient history. They're out there. They may be talking to students or school pupils and trying to educate them. They might be in workplace learning, trying to teach people to time manage or deal with difficult conversations, whatever. Why do they need to know what Aristotle said about learning?
Well, not so much Aristotle, although, interestingly, we go back to Plato and Aristotle. Plato is the rationalist, Aristotle is the scientist. So you may say right back 2,500 years ago, you had this bifurcation in the theory between reason and, on one side and empirical science on the other, that comes through into behaviorism, cognitive science, and all those theories much later on. But I think, why? I was in the business of building learning tech. This conference is called Online Educa, although when I heard the speaker this morning who opened on the keynote thing, I thought, you must be at the wrong conference, mate. You surely have turned up for the offline Educa conference. And I thought, this is amazing. And often, when I saw the German guy this morning, my head sank, really. because we get a keynote. We are the only profession in the world. Imagine if you were pediatrics or child nurses or child doctors, and you come along to a pediatric conference, and the main keynote on the first day stands up and says, "I really hate babies. We should stop having them." You go, "Are you kidding me? We do this every year. I don't know why." But coming back to the question, why? If you're going to build product, I think you should be duty-bound, like an engineer on a bridge should know about forces and stresses to build a bridge so we don't die when we cross it. I think the same is true in learning technology. If you're not building good pedagogy, good science, good design, because that's separate from the science of learning, then I think you're going to be building bad stuff. And to be honest, I've been in this business for 39 years now, that's building learning technologies, and you still see a lot of bad stuff. I've had it with a cartoon speech bubble, multiple choice question. You're learning stuff. I won't do it. I find it insulting almost as an adult to have to click on a little speech bubble to find out what Susan said about or some stupid story that they've dreamt up, like Peter and Paul infantile book type stuff. I don't think that's at all appropriate for adults. And we've been locked into this world because we have a bad piece of technology, which is authoring tools, which actually just have loads of cartoon libraries and templates for multiple choice questions, which I absolutely hate now. So I think we have to, if we're in the learning tech stuff, we have to know about learning first, tech second. But very often it's tech first and learning second. So I think it's an imperative if we're going to be successful in delivering to people. And we put up this facade. We think that everybody loves what we do, but honestly, go into a bar, take a stranger and say, "What do you think about HR or L&D in your organization? What do you think about that compliance online learning? You know that course you had to do on resilience? How did you find that?" And I'll tell you what the reaction is right now. They will sigh, they'll roll their eyes and go, "Jesus, where is this coming from?" In other words, we're a supply industry now. It used to be L&D would listen to the business, supply stuff, good stuff, in response to real goals, real people's needs. Now we're telling people what they're going to learn. You will, and the worst example of all, and I always quote this, is unconscious bias training. Since when did any individual middle manager in L&D HR have the right to come in and probe my unconsciousness, find those deep, dark creatures in there, and then accuse me of racism, sexism, or whatever? That is bizarre. Do you have any qualifications in psychotherapy? Even Freud didn't do this. And of course it's bogus, because the IAT test, even the people who designed the IAT test said, "Don't use this is madness." So I think sometimes by ignoring learning theory, we ignore good practice and we do terrible things.
So learning theory keeps us on the straight and narrow, as it were, in theory. But what was your rationale for the selection that you made? Now, we've had a lot of questions about this. Why did you select these people, not others? I think we'll deal with the not others a bit later. But for now, how did you go about finding a rationale for the selection? We started with the cognitivists, I remember, and then went on to the behaviorists.
Yeah, that's right. So the first group were the practical names I was hearing empirically from people that were being used in either academia or in schools or in the workplace. So that was, the sort of cognitives, the names like Bloom, Maslow, all those standard names that you hear. But then as it started to widen out, as social constructivism got a grip, you started to hear people like Vygotsky mentioned. But then it was quite clear that learning was, like if you go into schools, learning theory is a remarkable thing because we still have this enormous shadow of religion hanging over everything. So I used to hear storytelling a lot, and that's people who really believe, like Jesus, that everything should be a parable or a sermon. That's big in Western education. You don't really get it in China, who I've taught Chinese students. So there are all these shadows from the past. So we started doing things like, it's an interesting example, that one. If you take the Buddha, Confucius, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, right now, on this planet, most people who are going through an educational process are touched by those people. And what are the big issues at the moment in the world? Well, see what's happening in the Middle East right now with two groups of people. There's this massive cultural influence of religion. And of course, in Europe, we had Marxism. We had some of those post-Enlightenment narratives that massively, half the world has been influenced by Marxism in terms of education. China has a picture of Marx every year behind the government, and their educational policy is based on those Marxist principles. It all came to a horrible end with Pol Pot in 1975, but the truth of the matter is there are all sorts of, it's a bit like a rope. There are all these, well, more like a river with tributaries. We've got all these hidden tributaries coming into the learning and educational world, but we don't know what those tributaries are, and they all get wound up in this rather odd rope. And some of those tributaries are good and brilliant, but others are not so good. And I grew up in Scotland where Catholics and Protestants got separated into schools. I never met a Protestant until I went Catholic until I went to university, and I lived amongst Catholics. This is horrible. It's bizarre. And I've done a lot of work in Northern Ireland where they killed each other over this. So I think we've got to be very careful in not carrying on with this stuff and getting some sense into it.
So what kind of has become clear from this as we've looked at it and kind of shaped the podcast around these various groups of people is that there isn't really a canon.
No.
And are we attempting to build a canon? That's a question a couple of people have asked. Are you canon building? Do you believe in canons? I mean, Bloom and the other Bloom.
The other Bloom, yeah. Well, the other Bloom's on the list here, actually, because there are people who believe in a canon, which I don't, because surely we've got to the situation now where the European perspective is not the only perspective in the world. And what was interesting about this, I would say unashamedly that this is a selection, my personal selection, and it is definitely culturally biased.
Yeah.
Because I've grown up in this culture, and I just don't speak Chinese or any of those languages where I could take a deep dive into that.
That's another load of questions we've had about, why aren't there more African people? Why aren't there more Indian people? I think Indian people particularly came up with the religion, and there were certain religions they didn't feel were getting enough shot. Do you want to address that question of Western bias?
So, yeah, it's a question I've had many times. I remember somebody saying there are no Africans in the list, and it was my friend is an author, and it was his best friend. But the question was on Facebook, and she said, "You are a racist, but there are no Africans on the list." I said, "Hold on a minute." So my question back to her was interesting. I said, "How many Africans do you think are on the list?" And she said, "None." But she was wrong. And on this list behind me, I won't go into them now, there are something like 7 or 8 Africans, but she didn't know who the Africans were. So sometimes the charge is a bit false, okay? And in India, people like Sugata Mitra are there, or Ashok Ghoul, who's a big AI chatbot guy. Anybody who's involved in AI and learning should know who Ashok Ghoul is. Yeah. And then there are, a whole group of people from Russia, for example. You've got people like Pavlov, Vygotsky, Bakhtin. The Middle East, we've got Arab scholars in there as well. So I tried, but within the limitations of my cultural bound. I'm not pretending to be that this is some abstract world, global, perfect list. It's not a canon, it's a selection. And I'm quite willing to admit that I'm as biased as anybody on this, but that wasn't the aim to be.
Is that why there's so many Scottish people on here?
Yeah. Well, but that was the culture I grew up on. Actually, there are not many Scottish. There's Adam Smith, David Hume.
Yeah, not enough.
Two.
I was just trying to keep the mood light. Okay, so another question we had, and I remember actually it was just over there after we'd finished a similar session last year. A woman came up to me and she said, why are there so few women in the list? And that's one that's come up again and again.
Yeah, that's a really common question when we did the podcasts especially. But again, it was a bit like are there any Africans on the list? So the question I always put back is, so that is the list up, the list, I saw the list of 300. My question was, how many women do you think are on that list? So there's 300. But the women issue is really interesting because as I studied this across 2.5 millennia, it was quite clear that women were absolutely excluded, not only from being educated, but being educators until the early 20th century. This sounds like an astonishing thing, but it happens to be true historically. So the first woman we have in there comes actually a woman from the Sumerian culture, but it's questionable whether she exists. The first woman was Hypatia.
Anhedwana.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, useful mnemonic. So that is, girls just wanna. Yeah.
That's right. That was the first woman we had on the list. Then Hypatia, who was a philosopher in Alexandria, who got torn to shreds for her teaching methods, as did, of course, Socrates famously was killed because they thought he was polluting the minds of the young people in Athens. But then there's nothing. And there's nothing because the religious imperative through the Middle Ages was such that women had no opportunities to be either educated or educate others. Now, there's a very interesting woman here, which I discovered much later, called Martin, and she has written extensively on this. In other words, it's not that women weren't educating people. Women were mothers, they were matriarchs in society. They had an enormous role on educating people, but it was unrecognized and much more in the culture than through institutions. And in England, for example, women were quite literally excluded from the university system until the late 19th century, and hardly any became graduates in some subjects until the 20th century. So you wouldn't expect many women from the Middle Ages because the religious imperatives were such that it did not happen. However, a good thing happened. There are actually 30 women on the list, and most of them modern, 20th century. And as we go through there were some amazing people I discovered on that channel. My favorite is Jenny Lee. Jenny Lee was Scottish, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Jenny Lee was the brains behind the Open University, which is the biggest university in England now, 200,000 students, and other open universities owe a debt to her work. Amazing character. Judith Harris, who nobody's ever heard of, changed my life personally. I had twin boys, and I read her book on nurture when my boys were very young. My son's sitting here, he's one of those twins. That changed my life towards education and peer group pressure in particularly. But as we went through the 20th century, we had a marvelous group of women in the 90s, which was Marsick, Watkins, Gloria Gary, Alison Rossett, who actually turned around and said, forget all this courses, look at informal and institutional learning. They were the first people who recognized that learning is not an institutional game. Most of what we learn is not in school or universities or in courses, but in life itself. And they were really enlightening, and actually a lot of modern theory and the stuff that's coming through in performance support and in AI systems owes a debt to them very directly. So another amazing one that we discussed a lot was Maisie Clark.
Mamie Clark, yeah.
So Maisie Clark was a black woman in the days when hardly any black people were in the university system at all. I went to an Ivy League in the late 70s as a student, and there were no black people there. None. That's shocking. That's recent. And so Maisie Clark is a really exceptional character who was heavily involved with her husband in using dolls as experiments to uncover racism in both teachers and learners. And an amazing set of experiments. And I really love Maisie Clark because her work was practically used in courtrooms during the civil rights movement.
Led to Brown versus the Board of Education. Yep.
That's right. So she had a real causal effect for good in that sense. So there were a whole number of people like that that were uncovered, I didn't know. And when I go around and say these names, many other people don't know the names as well, but I think it's important that we do, in a sense, excavate the very good people who have had a causal effect on our lives that deserve some recognition in a way, yeah.
So as we get to the end of that why section, we have a roving mic. Are there any questions about that? Would anybody like to say, why didn't you pick so-and-so, my favorite theorist, or why did you have this other person, they were a load of junk? Now's your chance to ask another question. Ah, yes. Sana, down here at the front, please.
It's not really a why question, but I was wondering what really surprised you in all this time looking into learning theories and learning theorists. What surprised you the most?
There was one thing that I uncovered that I never knew before. And it was, there are two cognitive scientists called the Bjorks. Elizabeth Bjork was one of the women, in fact, and Roediger and McDaniel. So they did a lot of work on memory, shunting stuff from short to long-term memory through retrieval practice. But in every study, they had an extra bit in the empirical study, which was well designed, which was what were the learners' attitudes towards strategies in learning? And to cut to the quick, they came to an amazing conclusion, which is that learners are delusional about learning. I know this sounds weird, but this is why you should be very careful if you go and ask school kids or students about what they think about how they should learn, because they are absolutely delusional. So they will give you their preferences, which is normally the path of least resistance. Okay? So they'll all say they love lectures, then not turn up to them. So the empirical evidence is 40% of students don't turn up to lectures. Ask students how they like to learn, they say lectures. It's bizarre. So the empirical evidence clearly trumps the qualitative stuff because they just don't turn up. Imagine paying for a meal in a restaurant. So I'm running a restaurant, you've all paid for a meal, and 40% of you don't turn up. That would be a bizarre experiment. And I'd come to the conclusion that I should stop making food and shut the place down immediately. But we have put up with this for years. So that was a really big surprise, that one. And I think other ones I've already mentioned, which is what you might call bogus or fake theory. So a slide I kept seeing in learning theory at these conferences was one that some of you may have seen. It's disappearing now. And it was a triangle again with 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 70%, and 100% down the side. Now, anybody who's been involved in science would know that's bogus straight away. No data set ever comes down to 10, 20, 30, 40. And it's a thing called Dale's cone. I don't know. And the 100% was people learn best when they teach. Do you know that slide, the cone with 10, 20, 30? Now, my friend Will Thalheimer, who's an American, went and did the research. And I owe a great debt to him because he found that it was complete fake and that the person who had designed the triangle had gone back to an academic reference with a citation, a guy called Zhu, Z-H-U. He contacted Mr. Zhu at Harvard, and Mr. Zhu had never heard of Dale's cone, and it was completely fictional. In other words, it was a fake. So I have seen the Vice Chancellor of a British university put that in his slide deck. I've seen it in conferences all over the world. And that's what I mean by the importance that we uncover and have some reasonable archaeology here to get us back on the right path here, because there's a lot of bogus stuff floating around in our world that needs to be put to bed, really. I mean, some of these theories like Bloom are 70 years old. We've done no research in cognitive science since then? Are you kidding me? Of course we have. And so I think we're almost duty-bound if we're going to build stuff for other people and our kids especially to get this right.
Yeah, if I can have one there. The thing that surprised me most was to find out that the education system that we're all so used to was largely invented by Germans, German idealist philosophers, Prussians, in fact, Hegel, and help me out with the names, Donald, I can't remember them all. But all of these people were privately schooled. I mean, they were kind of one-to-one educated, and they invented a system of having like 30 people in a classroom, but none of them went through anything like that. They all had an individual tutor. I thought that was surprising and interesting. Yeah. And there's the 2 sigma problem.
Well, this is a really good example of the surprise. So, looking at the university system for a minute, it was quite clear what its history was. So all came around in the late 18th century through a group of German idealists. And these are names you'll know, like Goethe, Schelling, and so on. And there's one person in particular who came to Berlin, in fact, and the university is just down the road, and it's called the Humboldt University. Oh, Humboldt. Yeah. And so Wilhelm von Humboldt, his brother, was much smarter than him, I think. That's Alexander. He was a proper scientist. He was one of those people who were tutored at home, but decided that a university should be like this. We're going to have people who don't have to have any qualifications in teaching everybody. That was a mistake. That everything should be informed by research. I'm not convinced by this to this day. and that it should be a special elite group of people who inform society, and so on and so forth. Now that went through America, swung back around, and basically I've taught in universities all over the world, and they're all pretty much identical. They follow the Humboldtian model. Now, the Humboldtian model is flawed because it was based on German idealists, people like Fichte, on a high sense of individualism. This morning, I gave an internal laugh on this because I'm sorry to go on about this, but the speaker, the German speaker, I've forgotten his name, sorry, but he said at one point, and he said this, of course, Germany is full of humanists. We have humanists in Germany, but over there in America, they're really hard to find. I went, holy shit, did he really say that sentence? And he did. And this is an astonishing form of European arrogance, I think. Astonishing form of arrogance, that just because they voted somebody you don't like, they're not as morally virtuous as you. And we've got to get rid of all this stuff out of our system. And he also had a Bloom's, did you see the colored pyramid? Like, really? It's everywhere, this stuff. But we've got to be more serious, I think, in terms of the science and empirical evidence around what we do. It's not all science and empirical evidence, of course. There's sociology, political theory, economics, all sorts of things in the mix here.
So this is moving us on to the what. What have we learned? And I'm going to throw in a quote from Hegel here. What experience and history teaches us is that people have never learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. But we don't agree. We think we've learned something from the study of theorists, and I've certainly learned a lot from Great Minds on Learning. So now there are questions around this. Donald, it breaks down into different areas, but what's the picture that emerges, Donald, would you say, from the survey so far? Can you kind of draw a grand narrative from this, if you like? Have any worrying themes emerged? I think you talked about some worrying themes and zombie ideas. But why do they linger on so stubbornly? Is Hegel right about this? We just can't learn?
Well, going back to that analogy of the rope, you get all sorts of themes. One of the things that coming to the end of 300, and I'm still writing some of those, and we'll do more podcasts, I hope, is that there's this religious theme, there's the scientific theme, but it's not all right. We can't just go on and accumulate knowledge. In a sense, it's summed up in the phrase, I think, that education is a slow learner. So we still use Bloom, even though it's 70 years old, because we've not actually done any of the reading of modern cognitive science, probably. So we fossilize things in PowerPoints, and that becomes the train the trainer or teacher training course thing. That's bad, okay? But I think there's also another strand in the rope is the sort of faddish thing that happens in education and in workplace training. So every year there's one. 2 years ago, I remember, and you see it at this, I've been coming to this conference for a long time, and you see one a year. Last year was resilience training. I remember when it was mindfulness, and you can go back and pop these off. And it was very superficial, faddish, crappy solutions to serious problems. And I think that's one of the dangers here that came to the surface here. We had a lot. So let's take the mindfulness one as an example. There is a very strong theme in Western education and in workplace learning around therapeutic solutions that come straight out of Freud. So we cover Freud, we do Anna Freud, we do Melanie Klein, and then subsequent people like Erickson, right through to all those people who are applying the sort of therapeutic solutions through training in our institutions. It's a direct line. They've all read the one previously, but it's extremely suspect in terms of science. The idea that everybody has a deficit. So if you go into a workplace now, you will experience training that says, you have several cognitive deficits. You're racist, you're sexist, blah, 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 blah. And here's my solution. I'm the priest, I'll come along and cure you of this. And that's it done. And then we suddenly find people are very fragile, so we have to give them a dose of resilience training to bring them back up to normal again. That's how weirdly faddish some of this stuff is. And I think that's one we could put to one side somehow. Now, these are serious problems. Diversity, exclusion, and inequality are massive issues. But they're not solved by shoving people on a course and accusing them of something. You don't convince people to come with you if you accuse them of having a mental deficit. And I think that's a good example of another strand in here that's gone wrong.
Yeah.
And that's because we're holding on to things from the past. In that case, a post-Enlightenment narrative like utilitarianism. Remember when, and this happened at the conference, I remember Seligman and the happiness people. Happiness was a big thing for 2 years, and we all had published books. Seligman was the Pied Piper.
It's only 2 years of happiness, folks.
We had 2 years of happiness. It's now all, we're now all down in the door. Well, yeah, it's all doomsters now on AI.
Okay.
But I think we've got to be very careful with this stuff and cut it off at the pass before it gets carried away with itself. It has a sort of overreach.
Well, so but seriously on that point, similar point, I think, it's one from Joan Keevil, she's Scottish. What value do you place on reflection in learning, and how do you convince busy leaders and managers to slow down and do some reflecting? Now, reflection is a part of learning, isn't it? That's in the science?
Well, you had that word leaders in there, which always sparks me off.
Oh, right. Another hot button.
So go into a corporate, an average corporate now will have a good portion of its, but this is very recent, by the way. When I first came into this industry, there was no leadership training. We just called people managers and managing directors. We then called them chiefs, chief executive officers and so on. And then over the last really 5 to 8 years, huge sums of money have been spent on leadership training. This astonished me. And I know a lot about this because I was involved with companies who built this stuff. And boy, was I saddened to see the output. So leadership is a complicated academic background. And we did a whole podcast on this. So we went back. The guy who started it all off was really Taylor, but it was a guy called Burns. He was the first theorist. And he was actually quite good, actually, this stuff. We then come through Blanchard and Blanchard through into people like Cotter and Drucker and so on. But the three people who you never mention, who never get mentioned in a leadership course, are, I think, the three most important theorists in this area. Okay? And that's Pfeffer at Stanford, Kellerman at Harvard, and Mintzberg, who was at Chicago, I think. And they have been writing for a long time saying, stop with this leadership stuff. Because most leadership courses are, I've got some essential oils here. Compassion, empathy, be nice to people, blah, blah, blah. That's leadership. That's bullshit. It is bullshit. This is the therapeutic thing. The most successful leaders on the planet had none of those qualities. You've all got an iPhone. Steve Jobs had not one of those things. And so I think the great thing about Pfeffer and Helmer is if you really look at the academic theory in this stuff, these brilliant minds, Kellerman, was a woman at Harvard, said stop with the bullshit on training. It's complicated, very different types of personality styles, work in leadership. Some leaderships have no contact with their staff at all. I've got 100,000 people. I'm not going to be friends with them all. So what with the empathy thing, you know? So I think that's another really good example. So reflection,
yeah.
Let's not get over-obsessed by a tiny elite number of people at the top organizations who we spend all the money on and leaving the rest at the bottom. There's a session here by Tesco, and it's, I don't know, I'm sorry if the guy from Tesco's here, but Tesco's a massive supermarket in England. Tesco's leader has just given himself a 120% pay rise from 4.5 million to 12 million this year. Meanwhile, in April, when the basic wage went up by a few pence, they found a tax loophole so they could delay the payment by a month, and it saved them 18 million. This is what I mean. We're in a world now where we're supporting the people at the top of organizations with training and abandoning all the people at the bottom. There's hardly any really competent stuff. When I first came into this industry, it was all about training people and competencies on the ground. Now we've got abstract concepts like resilience and leadership. Any old abstract noun can be a course now. I think that's one of the big lessons I learned from this, that we need to go back to maybe looking at exactly what the goals of an organization are and training and teaching people in that context. And the same would be true in education. So for example, in education, why would we on earth would we teach Latin in schools? A dead language. and only one dialect of that dead language. Nobody speaks it. They're not all going to be Latin scholars. Don't imagine for 1 minute that they're going to be able to read Cicero when they get their little qualification. Why is it in all our schools? It's a hangover from the past, and it should have got rid of it many, many years ago.
So while we're talking about leadership and governance, there's one from Nikki Proctor, which will be the end of the kind of what we've learned section for some questions. Got your questions ready. This is an interesting one because we put out this call perhaps too early in the year. So he asked this question a long time ago, and events have kind of overtaken it a bit. He said, what would you advise the next UK government, that's not the one after this one, but now this one, to put in place to improve things, to learn faster and ideally prevent repeating these problems? He's not specific about the problems, or Nikki may well be a woman, I'm not sure. They're not specific about the problems, but we know that the last 14 years in the UK has been pretty troubled in many ways. And they got a bit of that party got a bit of a kicking at the election as a result. Nikki's studying for a PhD in L&D for sports coaching, and that's sadly interrupted by ME. Let's not get too specific about UK politics, Donald, because we'll be here all night. But more general, and also there are other podcasts about politics. So you may have heard of a couple of them. They pull an awful lot of listeners. More generally, to look at that, what useful lessons might we have learned from the podcast about the relationship between government and education? And historically speaking, that's been an interesting one, hasn't it?
This is a really good question, because one thing that's very clear from the history of learning theory and education and the workplace here is that very recently we sort of abandoned learning by doing or vocational learning. And I think that was because manufacturing was becoming automated and miners were, those jobs were disappearing. But this has been a huge mistake. So there are many good theorists on this going, by and large, even into the Victorian era, a school curriculum. I mean, I went to school and learnt some woodwork, metalwork, and blah, blah. I did practical things at school. That's all gone now. And we have decimated our vocational learning system. So this is not about the UK or any country. Most countries in the developed world have abandoned or skewed the educational system towards higher education. Okay? So you send your kid off to school at age 5, they pop out 22, 23, they do a master's, blah, blah, blah. And by and large, all of that has been text-based. In other words, most of it has been reading and writing and critiquing text. I'm getting a bit older now, and I'm deeply suspicious of this. I'm deeply suspicious of its text focus, because we now have a generation of not unemployed graduates, but underemployed graduates. So in the town we live, Brighton, you can go into any cafe and the barista in the cafe will be a graduate. That's underemployment. And we have an army of people, as I often say, who can critique Hamlet and hold a placard on climate change, but nobody who could build a windmill or do anything practical about it. So I'm being flippant there, but the educational skew towards theory and towards white-collar works, which are about to be decimated, I think, because of AI, is a big political and economic mistake. And at the same time, in many of our countries, we have massive shortages of skills. So in the UK, we have 40,000 vacancies for nurses. My mother was a nurse, my sister was a nurse, and I've said this many times, but they could not be a nurse in the UK now, because the educational system demands that a nurse be a graduate. And my mother, who's now no longer with us, it was not part of her world, her mindset to go to university. She was a working class woman who ended up working in factories, in fact. But she was a nurse as well. And I think I'm saddened by this, that we've abandoned vocational education and we underfund it. Because in my town, John will confirm this, we have building going all over the place for foreign students, and they go straight into really good luxury accommodation. And at the same time, we have homeless people sleeping in the foyers of those buildings. And I think enough is enough on this, really. You know, I think we've got to get a rebalance in the system politically. So that would be, and I've been a trustee in various big organizations in the UK, Learn Direct, City and Guilds and Vocational Learning, because all my life I've believed that we've abandoned the 50% of kids who don't go to university, and that's been a brutal, unfair and unsustainable thing. So that's one of the big things I learned when doing this was, there's like 1/2 of this is missing, learning by doing, learning to do stuff. And if all you've done is write essays and attend lectures, when you hit the real world, you'll find that you never get a lecture again and you never write an essay again. So even as a form of assessment, it's bizarre. So we get this big fight. And I feel sorry for people who are locked into this. The essays in the humanities is the essay. It's wholly inappropriate, as if that's the only form of assessment that's possible. The madness of that, that's easy. Real assessment is hard. So I think, in a funny sort of way, AI is stimulating us to think more about more sophisticated forms of assessment, which we should have been doing all along.
Hold that thought, because we're going to get onto AI, I promise. So let's have some questions here about what we've learned from the series. It would be interesting to, any people who've listened to Great Minds on Learning, who had a question about what they may have learned from it. Anybody? Yes, Alfred down here on the front row.
Microphone's coming.
Wait for the mic to get to you, Alfred, so you're on the tape. Still call it a tape.
I think what I have learned is that we as learning professionals are professionals that are not really skilled in the theories underlying what we do. So, that's why I listen to so many podcasts, because it gives me a bit more of the groundwork and the theories that we really need to understand to be good learning professionals. What you see is that a lot of learning professionals come from other areas in the company and have not been educated as learning professionals. So I think there's a lot of re-education or extra education necessary for learning professionals.
I think that's a really good point, actually. It's interesting. A while ago, I had a look around for books about learning theory, because I thought there must be loads. Because, thinking at some point, what could we do with Great Minds on Learning? Maybe we could do a nice picture book about it or something. And I found it was quite astonishing. That's why I say there's no canon, because you would have kind of like Gagne and a few Bloom and a few familiar names that we'd know about, but it was the number of people they talked about was tiny, and there was no link to any of the things that we'd covered, and I found that was really surprising. So I think there really ought to be, and it kind of pains me to say this, there should be other podcasts like Great Minds on Learning, which is terrible, because they probably come and do it better and, make money out of it or something. But it would be good to see 1,000 flowers blooming in terms of people learning more in the community about theory, I think. Anyway, we should move on now to the future, because I know you're itching to talk about the future. So the next question really is, what next? So here's a question from regular listener Jeff Vaughan, friend of the podcast, virtually. I've enjoyed picking up the nuance between yourself and Donald with regard to AI. I'm glad we're doing nuance, and it would be nice to hear Donald detailing some of his thoughts about where we may be going. Donald, a good number of our episodes have been about AI from its earliest roots, and I think people have felt that you had something really interesting to say about drawing out the roots of AI and where it's going now. I did an episode on generative AI this time last year. Such the pace of change in that market and in that kind of development of different tools, that field, we probably need an update. So how would you answer, Jeff?
Rather than jumping straight into the AI thing, the one thing that the history of learning taught me, and I wrote a book on this actually, I got so absorbed and interested in it, was the history of technology and learning is not what you think. It's much deeper. So let me give you an example. The invention of fire, which is probably Homo erectus, some people would argue not, a bit later. The invention of fire is really interesting because it extends your waking life into darkness, and you need a hearth and you need people sitting around the hearth, so you get an increase of storytelling and quite possibly an increase in skills transfer, because as adults have to teach young people how to make tools, clothing, and so on. So this dialectic between technology and learning and teaching is really interesting, I think. For example, I was in Lascaux this year in France and went into these amazing caves, and you see these astonishing images, but they are not possible without fire and light and brushes and pigments. So it goes way back, this thing. And then we have, of course, the invention of writing, only 4 places, in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and China. And amazing things happen when we have writing, but that's based on technology. It's based on papyrus, brushes, cuneiform, clay tablets. But then we jump forward now. It's always been here. There was a big one that took place, which was the invention of the blackboard. This was an amazing thing, because I went to school with a physical blackboard and chalk. And for the first time then, it had a massive effect on pedagogy. Before that, teachers would talk to their learners without turning their back on them. I think the blackboard was a disaster in learning, because suddenly everybody turned their back. And I remember going to Edinburgh University and going to a physics lecture, and the guy didn't even turn around once in the whole lecture. He just started on 3 gigantic blackboards and wrote formulas out and walked out the door at the end. So sometimes the invention of a technology is not good. And then we had printing, books, manuscripts. We carry on, and of course we then have the computer, then the internet, and now we have AI. So the interplay between technology and learning has always been there, and always massive in its impact. And I think we tend to underplay historically. For example, if you give kids now a pencil or pen to write an essay in a final assessment, you're making a big mistake if it's writing and critical thinking. Because that person is going to start top left, finish bottom right after 2 pages. Who in their right mind would say that's the way you write anything that's critical? You don't cut and paste. You don't change any words. You do nothing. You start top. So what do kids do? They memorize essays. They look at the past papers, make a probabilistic guess that these are the 3 themes that are coming up. They'll probably do 4 just to cover themselves. It's what I did. It's what every other student in the history of education has done for decades. And we call it critical thinking. The sort of madness sometimes of, the inappropriateness in that case of a pen or a pencil for writing long-form critical texts. So I think then jumping to AI, I think this is what has given us, I've never seen anything like this in technology, but I've never seen anything like this that offers us so much opportunity, which is why I was depressed this morning when I saw the first speaker. Because it was that doomster tale, that's that sci-fi doomsterism, robots everywhere, give me a break. Have you ever tried to make this? It's hard enough building anything without imagining it's going to come and kill you in your bed of an evening. So I think the AI thing has suddenly given its immediate impact for all of us is really interesting, because empirically what's happening here, in a school, a university, or the workplace, there are loads of people using AI, but they don't tell you. And it's called AI on the sly. Why? Because the institution has told you you can't use it. There are universities that have banned it, for example, but they certainly have a negative attitude towards it. Certainly universities, also schools. The same is true in the workplace. On the one side, you have employees and learners. On the other side, you have educational institutions and companies and public institutions. One side says no, the other side are using it anyway because it's so damn useful. It's so, holy shit, this is amazing useful, that they are driving this revolution. So the AI in the sly is the first thing. Why is that working? Because it's handing agency, which used to be a teacher. So I've gone on a little bit too long about courses and so on, but it used to be the case in a corporate, you would have to go on a course to learn anything. That's, of course, bullshit because you forget most of it. Now, I hold the key to learning because I can go into ChatGPT and do amazing things, but also learn amazing things. Okay? It happened with Google and search initially. The agency, the pendulum swung back towards the learner away from the teacher. You actually don't need to go on that many courses for some of this stuff now because it's at your fingertips. When you hit a problem, you go to ChatGPT and it helps you, not only to learn what you might not need to know, but to complete the task. That's a good thing for me. You know, these tools are like the calculator. I remember when the calculator produces numbers, AI produces text. A calculator is a number generator, AI is a text generator. Relax, folks. Don't get too utopian about this, as if everybody's going to be a researcher in the university and all the citation. I have had some people saying, oh my goodness, but surely every piece of text you write in AI should have a citation. I go, what world are you living in? A university. No, most communication is on social media, it's text that's nothing to do with research. And that's why this stuff is found to be wholly practical and useful. And a lot of the fringe cases, how many E's are there in Raspberry? Who cares? Who asks that question? Anybody? Anyway, I think we're worrying too much about abstract edge cases here. But my own view is that this is an amazing technology and it changes damn well everything. It changes the nature of work, it changes how we learn, why we learn, what we learn, especially how we learn. And that we've got to embrace it whilst being aware of its downsides and dangers. But that's true of all technology, so let's get on with it.
Do you think the sort of example you mentioned there is a kind of function of the fact that why generative AI in particular has suddenly got so kind of mainstream and everyone's obsessed with it, is that instead of being about maths, suddenly this thing is about language. So, you know, liberal bubble people like me whose skills probably tend more towards summarizing Hamlet than building windmills, suddenly feel, oh yes, this is about me. It's not about maths at all. It's language. I can get some agentic AI and I can talk to it in language, which I learned at my English literature degree summarizing Hamlet, get it to build a windmill for me.
Yeah, I don't think we should be too myopic about seeing generative AI as text only. So it's already multimodal.
Well, it's pictures as well.
Yeah, but
it's kind of moved into things we all deal with that are not, you know, part of a way there that's just the maths and the coders and the...
No, that's right. So, I mean, you have to give it time. This is only 2 years into the generative AI stuff. Yeah. Some of the stuff took centuries to develop, you know. But the interesting thing about how quickly this is happening now, so let me illustrate that by example. So next year, Google have made an announcement that you'll be able to upload videos to Gemini, and it will do a full analysis on the video. Now, if you're an educator and you've worked in vocational learning, you'll go, thank God somebody's done this at last. Because you can actually assess performance. Okay? You can actually upload a video and it will give you analysis of what the person was doing, whether they did it well. A simple example would be sports coaching. Okay? So I'm giving a talk I live in Brighton, I'm a Brighton and Hove supporter, and I'm so delighted because I'm giving a talk on AI and coaching at my football club in December. But they are talking about AI and coaching. And it's already hit them big time. They're using extremely sophisticated visual analysis on how to improve specific techniques in lots of sports. So it's the physical world, you know, it's now moving into that contextual work and the world of doing that I like so much. And I think we'll have a sort of renaissance in being able to assess and teach practical skills through this sort of stuff that's away from the text-based stuff. So my nephew, well, it's my wife's nephew on that side, he has a company that puts those ducts into restaurants, you know, those big silver things you see, it's very fashionable to have it in the restaurant now. And when they put them in, they very often make a big mistake and the inspector comes along and have to rip it out again. So the people who work in his company all have ChatGPT 4.0, the latest one, a paid-for version. And these are people with tools hanging off their belts. And they take pictures of it and then they test it against the BS and ISO standards so that it meets the standards so the guy inspector's not going to rip it out. So we must remember, it's not all about universities and schools here. There's the real world where people do real jobs that this stuff can be applied as well. And I think we'll see AI moving into that whole image recognition, 3D world as well, very, very quickly indeed, as it already is. And another good example would be avatars. So I was showing Jeff, I've made several avatars of myself, which just speak. You type in a text, speaks, any language. So there's Herman here from South Africa. Herman very kindly invited me to South Africa last year and had the avatar speaking Zulu, various languages. I mean, it was an amazing thing. You can now go to HeyGen and have an avatar of yourself, send a video from your mobile phone, and it will be interactive. You can ask it questions. That's weird. I never thought that would arrive on my desk anytime soon. So this real 3D world is already with us. And I think we've got to get away from the idea that this is just large language models. They're really multimodal in the true sense of the word.
Those two examples are just really brilliant. I mean, especially the ducting one. I hadn't heard that. That's great. So what does everybody else think about that? And can we have some questions now? We're going to have to move towards the end as we close out. Jeff. We haven't had Jeff. We'll come back to you, Salah. Yeah.
A lot of children don't know anymore where the milk is coming from. It's coming from a cow. No.
Milk from the bottle. Oh, I see already what the origin.
No, it's okay. I understand. The Scottish, etc. I understand. But if you ask a lot of children, they say this is the milk, and they don't know where the milk is coming. It's a cow. They've never seen a cow.
Yeah.
So what I've seen is that I agree that people learn and share and get dopamine because they know. I know you. You know me. But I'm afraid it's just a thought that with artificial intelligence, which is harvesting everything, that the individual is lost in space. You don't recognize people anymore. So how can you find out with who you have to work? It's just a question, okay? Because people rather talk to ChatGPT than people. So it's crazy because in the past I was responsible for learning. It's very hard to make people communicate with each other. I have a problem, I have a question, who can help me? So it was even hard to change that culture. And now we have ChatGPT, and everybody is asking questions, but they don't know the cow anymore.
Don't know the cow. So do we lose touch with the physical world?
Well, let me illustrate that again by an example. So the second speaker this morning was Paola Aurora, if you were at the session. And she gave it, I think her talk was really good. I have never met Paola before, but I've known her for nearly 17 years online. And I met her for the first time in the speaker's lounge this morning. And myself and Paola, I don't know if you remember a guy called Sugata Mitra. He used to be a big guy, keynote guy. So myself, Paola, and another guy at the University of South California were really suspicious about the Hole in the Wall project. I'm a technology guy. I just did not believe that you just put a computer on the wall and all these kids in Africa and elsewhere would just pick up stuff. Like, nothing in my experience said that would be possible. So I went there, and I went to an African hole in the wall in Namibia. Paola went to one in India, and John, I can't remember who, I think it was India also, and we found a disaster story. We spoke to the teachers, and they all said, one day somebody just turned up, drilled a hole in our wall, put a computer in. It was mostly boys who played games on it. No girls got near it. It was the very opposite of what the research said. So I went to the research. This was interesting. And of course, the research was self-published. It wasn't really serious journal stuff at all. And that's what I mean about us being careful with this stuff. And Sugata doesn't like me very much, obviously, because I published this stuff, but I think I was duty-bound to. And there was another great example, Nicholas Negroponte, who claimed to have gone to Ethiopia in a little crater, which is not that far from Addis, and claimed that these African kids had never seen the printed word before. I went, that's like, really? I said, this cannot be possible. So I was in Addis and asking people, and he claimed that these kids had hacked the iPad. Now, I don't know if you know who Nicholas Negroponte was, but he was really a business guy who was based in MIT and sold the one laptop per child program, made a lot of money from it. And of course, he was lying. Of course, these kids had seen print. There was a restaurant on that crater where you could buy a bottle of Merlot. It was just crazily ridiculous. So I think it's interesting knowing Herman, who works in South Africa. We've got to be very careful with this stuff, you know, about because my relationship with Paola's lasted all that time, and that's great. I didn't have to meet her in person there. I know hundreds of people online now who I've never met. Take myself back to when I was 15. I lived in a small mining town in Scotland. Do you know how many people I knew outside of that town? One. A pen pal in America. And I used to write to this kid, and it took 2 weeks to get a return letter. You know, there's my son sitting here who knows hundreds of people worldwide. What's the better world there? You know, the face-to-face world where you have to see people to know them, or a world where we have lots of ties with lots of people and our life is enriched by that. My life has been enriched by knowing Paola and her research. And Tamandra I know, because I know her face-to-face. I've only ever met her face-to-face, but then I've reviewed her book and all that sort of stuff. It's a mixture of online and offline. And that's the world we live in. So I'm not saddened. I don't think there is this massive loss. My son knows more people face-to-face and has a richer social life than I had at his age, even though he's a techie kid and an AI programmer. It doesn't make any difference. You know, he's heavily involved in sport. He plays sport in teams and, you know, has a richer life than I had at his age. So I think we've got to be careful of doomsaying about all this stuff and imagining that it's just everybody's locked up in their bedrooms doing nothing.
Yeah. And we also have to be careful with time. People need to go on and spend their rich social lives, and Callum needs to go off and meet these thousands and thousands of people that he knows.
And the party tonight.
And the party tonight. Don't miss the party tonight. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you're going to keep tuning in as we voyage forward and bring to the fore other great minds in the year to come. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project.